I like the quote that Islamic feminism is an unwanted child of political Islam. Yeah,
Yeah, that's from
that was
Siva.
that was very good actually. Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. And I think Zainab pointed out correctly about the current scenario especially in the Middle East, in Tunisia, in Turkey, in Egypt, and also in Morocco as well. Yeah, we had seen positive results from this Arab Spring, especially in Tunisia, I would say, right? But like the after effect is much less, if you see in Egypt, for example, probably because, as she said correctly, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So probably because Muslim Brotherhood, because of their ideology, main ideology was basically Islamism. So despite the fact that they tried to propose an amendment to the constitution to be a civil state rather than Islamic state, but somehow or other that we saw what happened in Egypt, right? Basically the intensification of power previously to President Morsi, right? So, and that was somehow rather a very authoritarian move. And similarly, we see the same thing is happening in Turkey, right? And I guess that's very important for us. And as Susanna correctly pointed out as well, that the impetus for this Arab Spring was not basically for a push for Islamic State or push for hudud. It was basically because of economic situation, right? And people have asked me, could we have this kind of wave in Arab Spring over here? I told them we are not probably that poor as compared to, we still have, we can still eat at Starbucks and stuff like that. So probably, so that's a problem, right? So it's basically because of the, and you know that the spark of it was started in Tunisia. Yeah, by Muhammad Bouazizi when he set himself alight, right, because of his protest against the regime at the time. So I guess I would like to open this floor for discussion, and I would welcome if you could introduce yourself briefly and perhaps direct your questions to the panelists. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I'll start first. My name is Afifa. So it's just a question for Susan. My name is Afifa. Just a general question, because it's clearly you are speaking to the choir. So for myself, I agree. But just with regards to just a question, because I think as much as we would like to be optimistic about certain things and we would like to have immediate change happening there at that region, wouldn't, just a general question, wouldn't ensuring democratic rights, or say for example your voting rights and all these things, it's guaranteed first before you start going to the social ambit, onto the treatment of women and all that stuff? Because I think I was looking at the news the other day, I think it's with regard to when they had I guess a referendum on the Egyptian constitution, and they interviewed, I think BBC interviewed several women, and a lot of women were saying that their priority at this time is to ensure at this moment that we have a government that we could believe in, or say for example that the lawmaking process is transparent. And I think they'd like to put their issues or their social issues secondary to that. So can you just provide a comment on that? Because it's really a sad situation that you have to sacrifice your, I guess, liberties in order for the system itself to be, I guess, closer to perfect, even though it's nowhere near perfect. Thank you.
Can I have one more question before I... Yeah. One more question, please. Yeah, Suri.
Hi, my name is Suri. I'm from Sisters in Islam. You know, what you said about how hudud, like that these are politically constructed and false dichotomies, and that really what's happening now is, I guess what you said about how these issues are being manipulated to serve short-term political gains really resonated with me, because I feel like to a certain extent we're puppets being played in this game, in this larger game where the issue then really isn't about Islam. And those who are engaged in the debate, those puppet masters in general, know the issue isn't about religion. But those at the receiving end of this public debate, so to speak, and I also feel that this debate isn't somewhat genuine because we're limited by this idea that, because the debate remains in the realm of theology, because we always debate, or people get stuck in, it's Islam versus an Islamic state versus a secular state. It's hudud versus civil law. And so we get stuck in this realm of theology. And it's interesting because that's how sometimes when I work on the CIS social media page, like the debates that people try and engage sisters in Islam in is at that level. But when you break it down and you ask them, how many of you have ever looked at the Kelantan Hudud enactment? Have you taken this piece of legislation and taken a look at it? How divine is this piece of legislation? How, and hardly anybody ever does. Because really, let me just pull up some of the troubling components, provisions within this, for example, include the termination of a marriage by a husband's accusation of zina, whether it's proven or not. There are all these things that are are un-Islamic and do not protect women, and yet they are included and on the premise that they are Islamic. But my question then for the panelists is how do we progress beyond that? How do we engage the public, general public, in a discussion where we move beyond the realm of theology? We actually look at the substance and the content and say, this is the issue. This is what we're debating. Because the reason why it's so emotive is because it stays in that realm, in this false dichotomy of where you have to choose between Islam and the civil law, between secular society and Islam. So how do we move beyond that? How do we make this a discussion where the masses are involved? And it's not just limited to small spaces like this, because what you hear in what you read and what you listen to, or like in the newspapers and in public, in like the media generally, is at the very emotive level. And it's difficult to transgress that boundary, to move beyond that. So how do we do that?
Thank you, Suri. Zaina? Yes.
Afifa, can you sum up your question again, just very quickly?
How do we move from the realm of?
Suri or
sorry.
Afifa?
Oh, sorry, Afifa.
Sorry.
Afifa
Oh,
was
sorry.
about choosing between democracy and women's rights. Like, should have democracy first, then only don't fight for women's rights now. Have the system in place first.
Well, it depends on the country, because if depending on how people have lived in that country, state by state, Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, for example, and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. So what is the type of society that they've grown in? If a woman doesn't, for example, let's go with the veil that Zaina mentioned, for example. If a woman feels that she is exposed without the veil, which happens in our society, for example, things like that, it's the perception that they grew up with. So it's very hard to say, okay, generally across the board, democratic. You want something that has to do with democracy. What is democracy, for example? The perception of democracy. If women don't have rights growing up, how is that woman, as a child, for example, raised? How does she deal with the idea of democracy? We're putting concepts that are alien, in a sense, from our own different global perspective, wherever we live, into societies that are still very much entrenched into, not going to say tribal, but it is in a way tribal, like in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. We have tribal tendencies still, even though the majority of people live in cities. And for example, in Saudi Arabia now, a lot of our young people are going abroad to continue their studies, either college or postgraduate. There's an opening up a bit in terms of horizons and perspective. Still, when they get back, they revert. back to the tribal sense of what is right and what is wrong. So when you talk about democracy, for them, it's not a question of democracy, it's a question of really what people, like in Tunisia, what happened? What instigated, what triggered the whole thing is just complete hopelessness and livelihood and insecurity. So when you reach that level, that's when people will start requesting democracy. If you're living comfortably, even if it's simple living, you're not going to request democracy. You're not going to, till it gets to the point where people can't earn their bread, like in Egypt, then people will move. And so when we ask them, okay, ask for democracy, what you're asking right now is request them to go into democracy basics, rights, and then move on to the social rights. It's not that. But what is the reality for a widowed woman in Saudi Arabia, for example, or a woman who's divorced and her husband actually, we have very, very amazing, in a sense, cases that come up in terms of rights that don't happen in other countries. We have women who, not just child marriages, but we have women who are divorced and are suspended in that sense of divorce for 7 years to 10 years. We call them mu'allaqat, hanging, the word hanging. And this is something that's not allowed Islamically, and yet we have them because the woman is trying to get her divorce and the husband's withholding the divorce. And it's something else. We had forced divorces in Saudi Arabia. You might have heard of those in the media. So the issues are very, very different, and I'm not going to say individualistic to Saudi Arabia, for example, but things that crop up that will not will not get us into the idea of democracy. People are living their lives and they want solutions, basically. Now, in terms of spreading awareness is what we need, really. Answering Suri's question. Spreading awareness really starts early on. If, as a child, you learn what is needed at home, that's how you get it. That's the only way. At school, it's not taught, but it spreads. So the key word really is awareness. That's the only word I can, and that's really effective. And it's a solution. It's spreading awareness. And it can be done in different ways. The methodologies are known, and they just need to move with it. I hope, yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Again, forcing people to choose what is more important. Let's have democracy elections first, and women's rights will come naturally once you have democracy. It just doesn't work that way. It's, we've learned from history. The minute the revolution is over, women have been out in the streets, and then they're like sent back, into the home, keep quiet, don't, just shut up and, wait until the time has come. I remember I met an OIC official at a meeting on women's rights in Kuala Lumpur, and, and I said, look, what is the OIC doing in terms of advancing women's rights, in Muslim countries? And he said, sister, we're getting there, be patient, it has to be slow. Why? Like Nima said, the women's rights, to equality, to a life of dignity, it's all in the Quran, revealed 1,400 years ago. And I said, look, we've been waiting for 1,400 years already, no more patience to wait, I mean, if we had been true to the teachings of Islam, the Muslim world will be at the forefront of the women's rights movement, not at the back. It's because we have betrayed the justice of Islam that we're way at the back, and the West is ahead of us, and then all these discriminatory laws that came from colonial rule, like the fact that the mother doesn't have the right of guardianship over the child upon divorce. It's not Islamic law, it's British law. And British law has changed to recognize a mother's right to equal guardianship of the child, because British law has changed. So that's Western law. This is Islamic law. It is not Islamic law, And if you look at, a lot of archival research are being done in Egypt. Scholars going to the archives looking at incredible marriage contracts, from the 10th century where the husband, at the time of marriage, in the marriage contract, gave the right to divorce should he take, dia belum polygamy lagi, should he take a second wife, his first wife has the right to divorce the second wife if she is not happy with the second wife. This is 10th century Egypt. You know, I mean, the most popular condition during the Ottoman period for hundreds of years in the marriage contract is, you know, the right of the wife to divorce the husband should he take a second wife. And yet when sisters in Islam campaigned for that to be included in the marriage contract, we're not saying automatic divorce, but should the first wife choose, she should be able to divorce, you know, file for divorce on the grounds that the husband has caused harm to her and the family because he's taken a second wife. Oh, un-Islamic, kafir and all that, when this was the most popular condition in the marriage contract for hundreds of years in the Ottoman Empire. You know, we're so ignorant of our own tradition, you know, that any rights that women's groups are demanding today is seen as kafir, as westernized, as against Islam. So I don't want women to be put in a position where you have to choose all the time. You know, we want women's rights now, and we want democracy now, and let's fight for that together. And what does democracy mean? What does justice mean when we say we want a just government? We don't want a despotic government. It also includes treating women as human beings of equal right and dignity. You know, discrimination against women is not justice. That's injustice. It's zalim. It's cruelty. You know. So let's define all these terms, you know, and be clear about what we mean. And yeah, Suri's question about, you know, how do we break, you know, that, yeah, you know, that, is it Islam, is it, you know, between Islam and, you know, and secularism, between hudud law and civil law, between tradition and modernity, you know, we need to do that. We need to create the voices. And I think, you know, we're so happy with the formation of IRF. You know, Sisters in Islam is not so lonely anymore. It's wonderful that we have IRF, we have Dr. Farooq, we have many voices are speaking out now. Thank God for social media. If not for, you know, the problem we have is the mainstream press. You know, in the rural areas, maybe people still are reading Utusan Melayu and Utusan Malaysia and their deliberate incitement of hatred. You know, and you know, the mainstream media remains, you know, remains a difficult platform to try, and especially the Malay mainstream media, you know, very, very, you know, ultra conservative and racist, and really does represent. You know, I don't care if they bring out. You know, they have Zulkifli Ahmad, you know, Zulkifli Nordin and all these people, Ibrahim Ali on the front pages, fine. But let other voices be heard. You know, the Malays in this country and the Muslims in this country are not one hegemonic people. They're diverse views, you know, progressive, secular, Islamic, conservative. Let all these voices be heard in Utusan Malaysia, and not just the Ibrahim Ali's and the Zulkifli Nordin's voice dominate the front pages of Utusan Malaysia. This is the problem that we have in the media and on RTM and TV3. Only one voice is heard unless the government supports the more progressive view. So for example, under Dr. Mahathir, very clear position that he took against the hudud law. So because the government is against the hudud law, then Sisters in Islam's voice also get heard on TV3 and RTM and all that, our position. But if this government is not clear about its position on the hudud law, then the voices against the hudud law don't get heard, you know. So this is the problem, is how do we break, you know, these spaces here, you know, in which diverse voices can be heard. You know, so the social media is extremely important. Education, you know, I mean, you know, IRF, Sisters in Islam, how many of us are there? We're small, you know, but again, unless you change the education system, how Islam is taught in the schools, in the universities, the kind of widespread change we want is not going to, we're not going to see it. It's going to be a very, very slow process, unlike Indonesia. You know, why? In Indonesia, you have people like, you know, of course, the late Gus Dur, the late Nurcholish Majid, and, you know, leaders in Indonesia who say no, who have the courage to publicly say no to Islamic State, no to hudud law, because they know that Islam will be ideologized, will be politicized, and it will lead to the division within the country, because there are, different kinds of Muslims in the country. But there is courage of the political leaders and main scholars in Indonesia to speak out against an Islamic State, against an ideological Islam. And that's really because, and also the Islamists, the groups in Indonesia, the women's groups, the human rights groups as well, incredibly very progressive groups, and all of them come from the pesantren tradition, the madrasah tradition, and the Islamic University, EIEN in Indonesia. Why are they so progressive? And that's really because of the way Islam is taught in the Islamic universities in Indonesia. They are taught social science, they're taught humanities, they're taught gender studies. I mean, I spoke to one woman who was teaching the Quran, tafsir, in the Islamic University in Jogja. And it's amazing. She says, she gives like a verse in the Quran, verse 434, and she will divide the class into groups. One group look at tafsir literature from the 11th, 12th century. Another group look at tafsir literature 17th, 18th, 19th century. Another group look at tafsir literature of contemporary period. So Fatima Manisi, Amina Wadud, even Sisters in Islam, letters to the editor, Sisters in Islam is part of the reference material of the Islamic University in Jakarta and Jogja. Here I came back, I called up my friends in the university. So, how do you teach tafsir? How do you teach contemporary Islam? They have a course in contemporary Islam. Look at the feminist writers and the progressive writers of today's world, and they study that. That is part of the curriculum in the Islamic University branches in Jakarta, Jogja, in Indonesia, but that is not so in Malaysia. So this is part of the problem. So Islam is taught as an ideology in the law faculty. I had a friend who reviewed the UIA law faculty curriculum, and he said, UIA is not teaching law. UIA is teaching ideology. So that's why you have all these voices coming out and joining the Attorney General's chambers and becoming legal advisors at the state level and come up with this very ideological Islam, and not the real Islam of compassion, of justice, of reform, of Islam. That's not the Islam that's being taught. So, so these kinds of people are being manufactured, by an ideological factory that you then send into the government departments, and how they are, the mess that we are in today. Where a judge can say, I'm a Muslim first, a judge second. Then resign if you're a Muslim first and a judge second. Your oath of office is to uphold the Constitution. If you cannot uphold the Constitution, you shouldn't be doing that job. Be an Islamic ideologue somewhere. Don't be a judge. But they don't see anything wrong in seeing such things. So the change, it's going to be hard, but I am positive because the voices, people are speaking out. Again, you cannot turn back the clock. People like Harusani, the Mufti of Perak, ultra-conservative Mufti of Perak, Nogado, the former Mufti of Johor. These are people who are trying to silence the dissenting voices, the debate, but they have not been successful. So for me, that's where the hope lies. How do you multiply the voices to the point where it is politically costly for our political leaders to continue with their silence, their complicity in these extremist voices, and really in the end, if the the dissenting voices become loud and there's a political cost, that's the only time the political leaders will start to listen. So for me, it's like the challenge for us in civil society is, how do you multiply those voices? How do you build the public outrage? Because without a political cause, I don't see the political masters changing. Look, PAS has changed. When I was covering PAS in the 1980s and early 90s, women cannot stand for elections in PAS. PAS, because the woman's voice is part of the aura, the women will be out in the streets campaigning and mixing with men and appealing to men, and this is going to be cause of fitna. That was the PAS position in the 1990s. Look at PAS today and the number of women candidates that they have. So that rhetoric has changed, So for me, that's where the hope lies. Eventually, reality has to catch up. But I think we also as citizens have to take proactive measures to get our voices heard and not to be scared, not to live in fear. We are citizens of this country. It's our country. We have as much right as the political puppet masters, to define what this society should be. Sorry, I speak too much.
Thank you, Zaina. Do you have any other questions? Yes, Julia?
My name is Julia. I just wanted to make a short remark first about that. You mentioned sisters in Islam, that they should be studied. In contemporary Malaysia, I believe that they are studied, but not the way we think it should be, rather as a threat to the mainstream Islam. And my question was addressed to Sister Nema. It's rather practical about, you seem to be a very outstanding product of your society. To be very active and doing many things, being a social activist, and it seems really outstanding and uncommon. I wanted to ask how many women are there like you, and also are there many people among men who would support the women's cause, and also isn't it dangerous in today's Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to speak out your concerns about women's rights? I mean, dangerous for personal security. Thank you.
Next question, please. Yes.
Hello, my name is Lim Pek Yin. So my question is, there's actually two questions. I would like to ask both panelists what are your thoughts on religion and the role it plays for an individual versus society, and what are your thoughts about religion being intertwined with politics. And I suppose I'm speaking in the context of after watching a BBC video titled How the Arab Spring Began. For me as an individual, when I see it, I understand that it's not about religion, but not constantly, you hear words like Shia, Sunni. So it kind of brings in, to me, it kind of muddies the whole entire issue, which is basically corruption, and people are angry with the government. So I just want to know, do you think that in general, what are your thoughts about religion? Yeah, because I think for me as an individual, I find it it kind of muddies the actual problem.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next one. Yeah. Yes, Brian.
Hello. My name is Rairi, and I just want to bring your attention to this news report that I read in the Malay Mail today. There is this statement by the ISMA president, I think, that says that, and I quote, feminism, is actually a facade, and is actually a Jewish conspiracy to to bring down women in Islam. So, like you say, it creates this sort of a false dichotomy that feminism and Islam are incompatible, that feminism cannot exist in Islam. So how do you tackle these sorts of, I would say, moronic statements from people like Isma and Perkasa? Have you considered going head-on against them, taking the bull by the horns, so to speak? Thanks.
Thank you, Rary. I guess that's a very important point, because the recent debate I had with Isma recently, with PAS as well, last week. Like they mentioned, even the United Nations was being set up by the Jews. Everything is a Jewish agenda, Jewish conspiracy. So this, I mentioned in my talk that it was basically they are trying to inculcate what is known as siege mentality among Muslims, and I guess it works somehow. And I guess I would like to panelists to comment on that as well. Thank you.
I'm going to try to be short, since we have several questions. Starting with Julia's question. Your question was 3 parts in terms of my own work. Personally, my journey has been, how can I call it? Because it's personal, it's very difficult to describe. But in terms of working on women's issues specifically, it's always been growing up in Mecca and in Saudi Arabia. I didn't grow up all of my life in Mecca. I'm from Mecca, but I didn't grow up there. But being from a Meccan family of scholars, I was taught very early on by both parents, by my late father Ismail Nawab and my mom, about the rights of all beings and the rights of souls, in a sense. So for me, there's never been that trap of falling into, well, men and women. I don't think of men and women in the sense of the gender inequality. I think of it as fairness and justice. So these are my drivers. From an early age, I also love animals. So any kind of justice, I always felt like any living creature, whether it's a plant, an animal, a soul, has rights. We as Muslims are taught that even the animals do tasbih, and the planets and the trees and the leaves and all that. So for me, any idea of, or I'm not going to say ideal, any concept that had to do with justice and fairness really bothered me as a child. I remember that's probably when that sense of need to at least voice, because I know being a change catalyst is not easy. I've been called a change catalyst. I've been dubbed a lot of things through the years by the media and by people, and that happens, especially where people are very quiet. I used to question a lot at school. I think it started very early on. My teachers, I had a teacher from Al-Azhar actually. In those days, we had lovely teachers from different countries in Saudi Arabia. Now it's being nationalized. Our education system is being nationalized. So in the past, we had teachers from Al-Azhar, from Syria, from Palestine, from Jordan, from Sudan. And so I remember one of my teachers from Al-Azhar who taught us religion used to tell us about her interactions with people from different faiths. And I grew up in a household where my father dealt with different faiths and invited people from different countries to the house, like his own dad did, in a different sense. I'm not going to go back too much into our family history right now, but the idea of acceptance and mutual respect. I don't like the word tolerance. It really, really bothers me when we talk about tolerance, because tolerance means you don't really like it, but you're tolerating something. And I think of mutual respect as what we need to strive for. So the idea of justice and the idea of respecting everybody, regardless. Up to now, I learned from children who are a year and a half. I don't put boundaries between religions, between cultures, between genders. So I think that's really helped in a sense in terms of marking my way and my mission in terms of, which has evolved, by the way. My mission has really evolved through the years, and you grow, subhanAllah. We grow in different ways. You learn a lot on a daily basis, and you should always learn on a daily basis. But to the extent that I like to mentor, and that's always been a big gap that we've had in our society, in our Arab world generally, is we have a lack of mentorship. So for me, the mission has been mentoring young people and those around me, sharing the knowledge and learning from each other and mentoring them towards improving themselves in different ways, towards contributing to the society in whichever way they feel fulfilled. We have hope and lack of hope, which is normal in many societies. And I've dealt a lot with women's issues, particularly, and youth issues. Youth issues, I'm constantly bombarded with youth issues by young men and young women. And I'll be presenting on youth and women later on in Malaysia, I think on the 29th as well, inshallah. So these are factors in why I do what I do. I haven't really thought in terms of the danger, though I'm constantly told about the danger that you mentioned. There are red lines. You need to know them, and you discover them. And I think what's happened with me is through the years, I've pushed my own personal bar in terms of what I say and what I write about. I've written a lot about politics in my poetry and in my writings generally. And I'm an artist. I'm a photographer. So for artists, we're very creative. We don't think of limits. That's another factor. It's not just the justice. It's also being, in essence, one with the soul of an artist. And for artists, our limits are very different than, I think, other people. We look at things in a different way and a different concept, and we don't look at them, I can't say in a practical, logical manner, but we look at things from a different perspective, and I see a lot of hope. I really see a lot of hope in our society still, which gives me the energy to continue, because there are lots of downs and a lot of ups. And the hope really rises for me with our youth, because when I look at the women's issues, it gets me down, because a lot is still not happening. But with our youth, a lot is happening, alhamdulillah, alhamd. And I can see, I mentor a lot of young girls, to answer your question. So I mentor a lot of young girls and men, and I try to help them fill in their gaps. That's my focus. So what are the gaps in, whether it's professional gaps or personal gaps in terms of their development? And what's happened is, in the past few years, and I've been asked this question before in Washington once, is the women that are active, the women who are touted by the media as spokespersons or so forth, or businesswomen, for example, in Saudi Arabia, which we have now seen a big increase in businesswomen, are usually the products of very rich families or those who are associated with royals. I come from a family that's self-made. My father was a self-made man, a middle-class family. So I'm actually one of the only one for my generation that's in that circumstance. They had to deal with a lot of issues, because I don't have that kind of a backing. I don't have that financial backing or other types of backing to fall on. But I'm mentoring a lot of young girls who are 13-year-olds and men. 13-year-olds up to now, I've been working with them for 10 to 15 years, so that are now almost reaching their 30s. So with them, I try to instill that sense of, forget about the sense of inequality and go for what you think is right. Go for justice. Go for, I'm not going to say equality, because right now we are still at ground zero. We're not even, we'd like to go to that sense, but we're still way, if our voices are not heard, our names are not mentioned, I'm going to go back to that point. Get to start from that place. I remember a young man told me once, he met, and this is a story, it was actually written in newspapers later. A man took his wife to a hospital, and the nurse unveiled his wife, and he started screaming at her. He said, "You can't do that." This was a very small village, by the way. This is an unusual story, but it just shows you the extent that what happens. And she was, the nurse was very surprised. She says, "Why? I'm not going to harm her, I'm unveiling her I need to examine her." He said, No, you can't unveil her. I've never seen her. Okay, so this is extreme. I mean, even when we read about it and we discussed it among our youth, this is an extreme, but it exists. There is that reality. There is a reality of men and women not meeting their sister-in-law, for example, or not sitting and getting to know your own family. So we talk about gender issues. I mean, it's really basic in many senses. And then we have, on the other hand, another facet where you have professional women dealing and mixing with men on a daily, constant basis. And that's something that started about maybe 15 years ago in Saudi Arabia. In certain companies, it started very slowly, because we've always had women enter two sectors. Basically, women were allowed to enter education, the educational sector, and the medical sector. That's how it started in terms of professions. Now, we're dealing with issues such as sexual harassment at the workplace, because now they've entered different types of workspaces. And so now we're having to deal with that and put mandates on that. So things are changing. As a writer, as a researcher, I used to notice that change happen every few years. Now it's every single day. There are things that are happening. New issues cropping up, new matters to deal with. Men supporting women in their cause. We do have a few men that do that, quite a few actually, and they're having a hard time because they get labeled as liberals. Because they're pro-women and they write about women's issues, or they talk about women's issues, or they advocate for women's issues, they're considered liberals. So we have a lot of labeling going on, sadly.
That's a bad word in the Muslim
Yes, that's very sad. Linda, role of religion and politics. I think that's a trap that we fall into. I really am very worried about what's going to happen with the new divide. We've always had different types of divides. Now, the worst divide has happened since the Iraqi war. It started with the Sunni-Shia divide. We've always thought we're Muslims regardless in terms of Islam. And now the Iraqi war really started. I could see it happening when it happened. It started with the Iraqi war, when in Iraq you had mixed marriages of Sunnis and Shias. The people never thought Sunni and Shia. Anyway, it's part of, nobody would think about it. The same is now happening in Egypt. You have people in Egypt who are saying, oh, our neighbors are Christians, our neighbors are this. They never used to even think to ask which religion someone belongs to in Egypt. So it's not just, it's different types of divides in terms of faith. And that's really something that's quite dangerous when we deviate from humanity itself, when we deviate from the human bonds that you meet somebody in an airport, you sit next to them, you don't know who they are, you end up knowing them. A lot of you are shaking. Yes, okay. So you end up talking to that person, you might become friends for life. You meet others. So you don't think in terms of personal meetings are beautiful. They're fulfilling. They bring a lot. They're enriching. Yet the political divides are politically driven. And the Islamic divides now are politically driven. There is an agenda, and you feel it. We all are worried about this political agenda that's driving certain entities to push for further and further divides within the Islamic world, which is very, very dangerous. We never used to think Sunni and Shia. Where I live in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, we have a big Shia group because they live very close to us. And they work in this area where you have oil companies and so forth. So we have sections in Saudi Arabia, we have Shias. We never used to think about, we never even thought. I remember in Mecca, I was talking to one of my cousins when I was 7 or 8, and somebody said Shia, and the guy said Shiuri. Now, Shiuri means communist, and Shia means Shia. So to that extent, in Mecca, and we never really thought, what is a Shia? They didn't even understand the concept of a Shia. They didn't know what that meant. They're Muslims. In Jeddah, up to now, we have families where Sunnis and Shias intermarry. It's not a problem. But nowadays, it is a problem. I'm noticing it more among our youth. The youth that I work with, girls and boys, are kind of now, if we're in a sitting arrangement, or we're in a gathering, and there's a Shia in the gathering, they're very much politically aware, whereas in the past, 2 years ago, it was the same group, for example. 2 years ago, they would never even mention that person being a Shia. And now they'll say, oh, we have to watch what we're saying because he's a Shia or she's a Shia. So we can't talk about certain issues because we don't want for them to be too sensitive about it. Maybe they'll mistake it if we mention this. So that divide is getting to our youth. Anything that gets to our youth is a problem. Anything that's ingrained as something new is a problem. Because to overcome it takes a lot. It's very easy to plant something. It's very hard to uproot it. Very hard, especially when it comes to unfairness or hatred or causing divisions. Last, feminism. You want to answer that question? No, it's too much. Okay. I think we might be running out of time. Okay, Zuberi, you mentioned the idea of feminism as a facade. And
Someone saying that.
Yeah, someone saying that in the media today in a newspaper article. And then feminism and Islam as incompatible. I've always thought of Islam as the most pro-women religion ever. And also I used to call it pro-feminist religion. I remember the first 3 years, a long time ago when I started lecturing in the US at a very early age. I'd get asked questions about inequality for Muslim women. And I'd say, Islam is a feminist religion. You have more, but the reality is the way people are enforcing the religion, as you know, is different. So I don't see a contention, and people can use that phrase however much they want to say. I think as Muslims, we all know for sure that Islam is a pro-women religion. So they can go ahead with their labels. It's not going to work. And Jewish conspiracy, that's the favorite thing for everybody to just throw it on. Yes, so I hope I answered your questions.
Yeah, just quickly. Yeah, I mean, this whole Isma phenomenon. We need to dig out more, like suddenly, they're like hogging the public space, Who are they? Where's their money? I think we need to really dig out where their sources of money are, and the level of offensiveness that they're allowed to get away with nobody in authority challenging them, in fact supporting them. So whose game are they playing? There must be political masters behind them giving them support, and we've heard, that there are. They are aligned to a political party. So I think that they're just, to muddy the waters even further. And how much, for me, for Sisters in Islam, it's like, it's always been a constant debate for us, how much time and energy do we want to spend on extremists like them? When we feel that the majority of people are actually moderate, able to think, able to change. So should we be concentrating our energy, on trying to change people who are sitting on the fence, people who might be conservative but open to ideas, open to new knowledge, new scholarship? Or should we spend our energy on the likes of Ibrahim Ali and Zulkifli Nordin and the Ismas of this world, who will never change? Right? So it's like what they said today is what they've said 30 years ago, 40 years ago. The world has changed. Women have changed, and they're still stuck, in this politics of race, religion, hatred, thinking. So really, I think the question is, how much time do we want to spend in responding forever? They're setting the agenda and we respond to them. Or should we just spend our energy, our time, our scholarship concentrating on what is it that we stand for and getting that message heard wider and wider, and doing the trainings and engaging with young people, to really build that public space in terms of debate and getting the progressive voices heard wider and wider. So, everything that he says is nonsense. Everything that comes out from the mouth of Isma is nonsense. And they can be challenged, very easily demolished. So actually for me, go ahead and say all your stupid things. Feminism is a Jewish conspiracy, because the more they speak, the more, their credibility is, they have no credibility because they speak nonsense. You cannot back a single thing they say with fact, with reality on the ground, So they just mouth, but it's amazing for me that they're so shameless in their stupidity. This shameless display of racism, of bigotry, of stupidity, and trying to claim this is what Islam stands for. That's where I get angry, because they're claiming this is what Islam is. I am outraged at the way they've abused Islam in this manner, and they're not being challenged by people at the top. Yeah, so I think we should concentrate on what is it that we're doing, the kind of Islam of justice, of equality, of compassion that we stand for, and let them kill themselves, really, let them dig the hole deeper and deeper, and I think more people should file suits against them, so that these millions that they're supposed to be getting from some sources, just empty out in terms of paying defamation, fees, in terms of religion and politics, I really, like Nima said, I went to religious school for 5 years. I never heard the word Shia. I never knew the word, there are Shia Muslims, until the Iranian Revolution and the consequences of the Iranian Revolution. Suddenly the Shias are a threat to Sunni. And even PAS, which in the first few years of the Iranian Revolution had Khomeini pictures all over the meeting rooms and their offices, suddenly, like how many years later, suddenly Shias are kafirs. And like, who are the puppet masters who gave PAS millions of dollars to take this? And interestingly, PAS and Jakim took the position that Shias are kafir at the same time. So obviously, there's political motivation in this. Suddenly the Shias are, beyond the pale, they're not real Muslims, but that's not the Islam. It's the same. Like, we're all Muslims. There's no Shia-Sunni divide. So this is really politically driven. This is, identity politics used again for very secular purposes. I think it's ideal to say take religion out of politics, because when religion is in politics, it just divides people, it causes bloodshed, divisions and all that. But that's not the reality. Religion is in politics, so how the issue, the challenge is how do we manage that? And the sad thing is that so many of our political leaders, and this is throughout the Muslim world, just don't have the courage to deal with the challenge of religion. The Islamist groups, the extremist groups, they just don't have the courage to deal with that, and would rather just sweep it under the carpet. And this is where, like, my criticism of this government is, by your silence, you're complicit. You're complicit in the extremism that's growing, the conservatism and the intolerance that's growing in this country by your inaction, or by your support. Some of the cabinet ministers, support ISMA. And you see the rhetoric of ISMA being echoed, by some of the, certainly by the Minister for Religion, for example, And, so it is a tough challenge, but the reality is that, religion is a source of law and public policy in Malaysia. Religion is part of politics in Malaysia. It's how do we learn to manage it, and this is why, in terms of the work that we do, the idea that, no, you're not a scholar of Islam, so therefore you don't have a right to speak on Islam. You don't speak Arabic, so therefore you don't know Islam. You're not a Muslim, so therefore you don't have a right to speak on Islam. To break all these tools, tactics to silence dissident voices is, I tell them, look, if you don't want sisters in Islam, or the Chinese, or the Indians, or those who don't speak Arabic, or those who don't have a degree from Al-Azhar to speak about Islam, then you take out religion from the public space. Very easy. You take out religion from the public space, you take out religion as the use of religion as a source of law and public policy, then I will shut up. I will happily shut up, because you can say what you want to say, it doesn't have any impact on me. I'm not going to be sent to jail, I'm not going to be sentenced to death, I'm not going to have my hands and feet cut off and all that, because it's just your opinion. But when you want to use religion as a source of law and public policy, then every single Malaysian has a right to speak out. Because in the end, what we're talking about is public law and public policy. It's human-made laws. Parliament, God doesn't sit in Parliament. It's human beings who sit in Parliament and debate these laws and pass them in Parliament, in the State Assembly. It's human beings. These are man-made laws. So, don't hide behind the facade of this is divine law. This is not divine law. And this is why I'm outraged, because you're abusing God and you're abusing Islam, and you're bringing disrepute to Islam and trying to hide behind Islam to perpetuate your control, your patriarchy, your misogyny, and basically to resist the change that's taking place on the ground, So I think the important thing is to really, all of you who are here obviously want to learn something new, want to hear different voices, for people like you to speak out, to write in the social media, to speak out in your family, among your friends, to really build that clamor demanding a different understanding of Islam. Just one thing about women in Saudi Arabia. I've met incredibly strong women from Saudi Arabia. One of my good friends from Saudi Arabia is a university professor. And she was the one who organized, when Saudi Arabia introduced local elections a few years ago, is it 5-6 years ago? She organized a group of 8 women, met secretly, to march to the local council. I can't remember whether it's Jeddah, probably Jeddah.
Yes, it's Jeddah.
Yeah, Jeddah, to demand forms to stand for elections, knowing that in Saudi Arabia women cannot stand for elections. But again, this is how you create the debate and the public space and open up the space for debate. Knowing that women cannot stand for elections, women can't even vote, No, just organize, publicly march, call the media, ask the media to cover it, issue a press statement, make a stand saying that we want to stand for elections. Of course, the city council had to say, you can't stand for elections, but that hit the whole world, the whole world media covered that, and they had to promise that, okay, we're going to review this, and now women can vote, right, in the local elections?
They
Can they stand?
They can stand for elections.
Yeah.
We have municipal elections, and
Yeah.
these women are phenomenal, mashallah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wonderful. So, but that's how you begin. You up the ante, you get the debate, and the pressure, and shame the government. That's the only way these governments change.
It's really raising the bar, as I mentioned. Every time
Yeah.
there's something that you need that is essential. It's
Yeah.
not something superficial, something essential that's needed.
Yeah.
Just raise that bar and try, because it's
Yeah.
usually, for us in Saudi Arabia, we talked about this earlier before we started, a lot of these issues have to do with the perception in the society versus what can be mandated by law. A lot of things can be mandated by law and actually get through. It's very interesting to see that happen in Saudi Arabia, and that's a big thread of hope for us, a thread of hope, a ray of hope, in a sense that we do get these laws passed once voices are heard and once things are happening. And actually, we're backed more in the laws sometimes, more than we get backed by the society itself. The uproar comes from the society, from the conservative, extremely conservative voices of both men and women. Whereas when you, for example, the right to drive, the right to municipal elections, the right to enter the Majlis Shura, the Shura Council, for example, they all went through in different ways. And we got the go-ahead for them. Even the right to drive, we got the go-ahead, by the way. Go, drive. We still hear that all the time. What's stopping you from driving? We're not telling you not to drive. It's the society. Very interesting. It's very different. It's an interesting, when you think about it as a case study, if you want to think about it that way, it's very interesting. Yeah, the opposition comes from within the society.
Yeah, but I think when, more, I mean, you need to build that critical
Yes,
mass of
we are.
protest. I mean, like, for example, in Iran, you're supposed to cover up. Your hair is not to be shown. But thousands and thousands of women are out in the streets with hair here, hair at the back, and just a strip of scarf. How can the moral police arrest all these thousands of women? They can't, and so they give up. And occasionally there might be a crackdown, but women are just protesting. Like, the last time I was in Iran, they were like planning, okay, summer is coming. Shall we start not wearing socks and wear open-toe sandals? Shall we, there's it's like, how do you break the law? How do you break, and when there is that critical mass of women breaking the law on a daily basis, the system collapses, So how is building in the same way here too, building that critical mass of voices so that there is a political cost, to the political masters in continuing, in the absurd, ways, So it's building that voice, I feel, is extremely important, and really the hope lies with you young people. Just standing up, speaking out, protesting, and demanding change and bringing about change.
Right. Thank you, Zaina. I guess we open up for one last round. I'll take two questions, two more questions maximum, and then we're going to close it. Yep, please.
Hi, Mina from FZ.com. I would just like to ask about these really small underground movements, in places like Afghanistan, whereby you have women engaging in bringing back the revival of Pashtun poetry and using that as a tool of empowerment and also protection among the female community itself. So I'm just wondering, how far have they gone in terms of representing women's voices in the society? I mean, are these poetry being read out in public, things like that? And also extending it to the areas that were Tunisia, Egypt. You have really small underground movements of women, but they're very specific. Like in Egypt, I think it's about sexual harassment. So I'm just wondering, how does these movements that are really specific in nature, how does that translate to changing the perception in the society about women's rights and women's roles? Thank you.
All right. One more, please. Last one. Last question. Anyone?
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, that's the last one. Yep. Thanks.
Yeah. The Persian poetry in Afghanistan that you mentioned is a very interesting case in the sense that poets as artists move. Now, to start something like that, by the way, with poetry and other forms of art, I think our artists in the Arab world are doing a lot, not just with poetry, but generally in all the arts, and they're pushing the limits a lot. With regards to women specifically, for women to band together, and I really, really have been working, for example, for many, many years in terms of when we get together as women, we need to band together. It's not a question of a one-woman campaign. That really harms us. We've had some campaigns that really brought things down to a standstill because they're run by one woman who chose to just go ahead without the support of others. So that's one cautionary note when we talk about women's movements generally, whether in the arts or outside the arts. So with regards to the poetry, specifically, the poetry in Afghanistan has gone through, it's made the media, and once again, once you get to that point where the women work together in a group, a network together to bring something to fruition, and then the media picks it up, the media begins to become a very strong tool, not just a factor, but a strong tool of disseminating this information to others and getting more wider support. So the use of the media by these women campaigners, of course, as we know, is very, very crucial. To do that in villages, for example, rural societies, is very hard. So what happened in Afghanistan was very interesting in many different senses because it happened in a very small area, in a rural area, not just a city, and with people who don't really have much access to the media and yet got picked up. So that was fascinating in that sense. For us, in terms of women writers, for example, we started a group out of one of the ladies you might know, Hatun Al-Fasi, a dear friend of ours. She's a women's history professor, the only women's history professor that we have that was based in Riyadh. And she's originally also from Mecca. And we started as a group of 5 women writers that started maybe about 7 or 8 years ago. In those days, it was pre-Facebook, it just started emails. Because for writers, for many of us, we don't have writers' conferences in the Arab world. We don't have ways of networking. I work on workshops for writers. It's really hard. I started that. Nobody did that in the past. Up to now, very few in the Arab world do that. I've tried to get men and women to be involved. It's not happening easily. So what Hatun and a group of us did, we started a group on just to get to know each other, because the problem in the beginning was we didn't even know who's out there. Starting again from ground zero, just to get the group together to find out who is there and what they're doing. We don't have a database. We have nothing. We just know, oh, so-and-so lives in that city and wrote this book, for example. So bit by bit, we spread out a bit more, and through emails in those days, which was really hard. It was very crucial at that time, and it was very, I'm going to say, dangerous in a sense, because in those days, any kind of banding together was looked upon. It was like, okay, why are they getting together? So we didn't get together physically. We got together on the internet. And we started exchanging our aims and our goals as women writers, for example. Okay, what do we need to do? We want to work on women's rights, and that's what we started doing. We started campaigning for women's rights through our women's writing group. We wanted to be active, because a lot of us were already active in women's group things, but we didn't know, a lot of them didn't know how to do it. So together through the internet, we got together, got to know each other, so-and-so, these are numbers, established a small database within our group. It grew up to, from 5 up to 70 plus. And that was a major happening. That was a major achievement at that time, in the year 2000, for example. Now, of course, this is much wider. We have more women, younger women, joining our groups in terms of activism through arts, for example. And through the arts, we're able to convey a lot. Through artwork, photography, through drawing, through painting, through written work, we're able to address a lot of our social issues. For me, I remember when I was going in the U.S., especially once I was at a workshop, and a lot of the U.S. writers told me, your writing is all about the society about politics, global. Where are you in your poems? I say, I divorce myself from my poems. I'm not interested in writing about myself or about my life. Yeah, but it's interesting. I said, I don't care. My concerns are the society. I want to write about our society. I want to write about divorced women. I want to write about a child who's being abused, for example. And they're not things that I've been exposed to. They're things I imagine. And that's the challenge for any artist, is to imagine what it's like. And for poets, to imagine where you're at a place that you've never been and create that environment and that scene through your writing. And so I didn't have any what they call I poems in my work at that time. My new book, the latest one, Canvas of the Soul, which has been recently released as well, there are a lot of I poems there because it's a spiritual book. It's Sufi poetry, actually. And the I is not me, necessarily. It's about the soul. So it's a hidden I. So campaigning through artwork is very strong in the Arab world and in the Middle East. We can say a lot because Arabs, by nature, work on symbolism. And when you talk about language, specifically, not just art, but language, our language is very rich and very symbolic. And so with poetry, whether it's written in English or in Arabic, you can say a lot. And the meanings, I build my poems on layers and layers of meanings. So the meanings are there, they're very deep. Every time you read the poem, you'll get another sense of another meaning. And you will interpret it one way, Zaina will interpret it another, Dr. Musa will interpret it another way. And that's the beauty of art as well. So the messages that you can do as an artist, you can be an activist as well as an artist. And that's what I've always felt. Through artwork, the combination works, basically.
Thank you. Zena, do you want to add anything? One last word.
Yeah, maybe just quickly in terms of, these small groups emerging in different Arab countries, never underestimate the power of, a small group to grow and to bring change. I think if the issues, it really depends on the issues and your strategies. If the issues you bring up, is something that resonates within society, like what Nima said, this change is so needed, it will grow in impact. I mean, when you think of Sisters in Islam and how we began with just 8 women, and people think, people are always shocked. You mean there are only 8 women? It's like the impact we have made, the voice we have created, not just at the national level, internationally as well, because it is an issue whose time has come. The idea of women's right to equality, to justice, the necessity of change, of reform within Islam. There's resonance on the ground. People are demanding it. So even though you're just like 8 women, how 8 women can actually create a public voice and a public space, to demand change, because the time has come for that voice to be heard. So I think, for people who think that, oh no, it's so difficult, everybody, like we said, just do it. Just do it, with the power of just a few friends together, banding together, like 5 women forming the writers group, 7 women marching to City Hall, demanding the forms for them to fill to stand as candidates for local elections. These are the catalysts towards change. So I wouldn't at all underestimate the ability of these single issue groups or small groups, to really then be able to join hands with other small groups and together, to bring that change, to make these voices public. It's these voices that need to be heard, and I think the days of silencing the women's voice, you just can't turn back the clock anymore to go behind closed doors, and whisper, because we still get, why don't you just whisper in the right ears? Excuse me, this is like 2014, like tiptoe, whisper in your husband's ears, who's the cabinet minister, to bring about the law reform. No, we want to make change sustainable, and for change to be sustainable, society has to change. Society must want that change, and we need to build that public education, that voice in society, wanting that change, demanding the change, for change to be sustainable.
One thing with regards to the writers group, it's an activist writers group. So we're all activists, and we decided our mission early on, and then we set up a list of goals. Some of the campaigns we've been involved with were actually the municipal election that started with our group. The members are in our group, actually, and we discussed it, and And how to deal with it? Yes, and how we do. Hatun was actually one of the group leaders, and how we started, how to deal with it. We've worked on other issues that are also regarding, for example, they were trying to segregate the tawaf in Mecca and break up in Medina, and they succeeded in one and didn't succeed in another. So the issues were many and varied. We also campaigned for the forced divorce, against it, and that helped reform the judicial system in Saudi Arabia completely because of what happened with the forced divorce. You can look up forced divorce in Saudi Arabia on your Google search and you read about it. So things like that. So through the writers group, that was our first really activist women's group, because a lot of us were activists, but we were very small. As Zaina mentioned, we were a group of 5 or 6, and now we've grown. And now we have other activists that will approach us. They might not necessarily be writers, but they'll approach us in terms of, how do we campaign for this? How do we do this? What tools do we use? And then network with them and try to support them if it's valid, because some of them, as I said, if it's a one-woman campaign, it's going to backfire. So the need to work together as team members, the need to have a cohesive mission and a sustained one, and how to approach it. With the forced divorce, we decided to write a petition, international petition in both English and Arabic. I worked on the English, others worked on it in Arabic. It got to the king of Saudi Arabia. He actually got involved. He never usually gets involved with the judicial system. He did this time. He stepped in. It got to a crucial point. With the tawaf in Mecca, for example, we were able to stop the tawaf because what we did is we went actively for a month and a half or two. We sustained on every single media outlet, whether it's radio, television, written, spoken, whatever, with our men. We actually involved the men with it. Items about awareness, basically, awareness of what's going to happen if we have the mosque in Mecca segregated and the tawaf segregated, because it was two things. It was segregating the mosque and segregating the tawaf, which would have been a disaster. At the same time, Medina we were told that Medina is going to be segregated, and this has happened. Medina is now, as for those who've been to Medina, is no longer where families can go in together. Women are allowed in at certain times, and it's just something that we have to deal with now. So I'm very active right now, for example, on I'm not going to say it's a campaign, on the destruction of the holy sites. I tweet about it a lot. And that's something that's, in terms of danger, it is not easy, because people will take it, people are trying to politicize it, sadly. I mean, I've heard some people who are trying to put, they try to put a different connotation on, oh, you mean you're against, it's not, I'm not against this or that, I'm talking about history. So you have to be very careful as an activist in terms of what you decide is close to your heart and your soul, and you want to adopt and push for. So it is not easy to do something like talk about the destruction of Mecca and Medina holy sites, because this is not an expansion of the mosques. This is systematic destruction of sacred sites, of wells, of orchards, of places of interest. Last time I was in Medina, there's a footstep of the Prophet ﷺ on one of the mountains. It's been removed. You could actually see his imprint of his arms and shoulders as he lay down, and of his foot. The foot has been removed. So that's just a small example. Every time I go to visit Uhud, for example, in Medina, it breaks my heart. It's now been fenced in. They've cemented an area that the Prophet ﷺ went through. They actually poured cement through so that other pilgrims don't come and turn it into a place where they will kind of like a holy site kind of thing. And the reasons behind it. So you have to really be aware, really study what you're going to go into in terms of activism. And it is tough, and it is difficult, and you have to go back into history, understand, and be analytical about it, not be emotional, because if you're going to be emotional about it, you're going to lose. And you do it in different ways. Push the bar and know how to push it, basically.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Sister Nima and Sister Zaina.